Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I've been eyeing this one for a little while since it came out, and I've been wanting to get into some more Native American history for a while now, and this affords a great opportunity for that. This is the story of Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull is a name that I think was given to him by English-speaking Americans. I don't believe that's really a proper translation of his name, but beyond that, I don't know a ton about the life of Sitting Bull, except for where his story intersects with that of American history at places like Little Bighorn, and then later on with the events surrounding the Ghost Dance and the Wounded Knee Massacre and things of that nature. So we're going to dive into that story today using our friends at Extra History as a jumping off point for that. As I often do with Extra History videos, I'm going to do 2 episodes together today, and then we'll do the other 2 tomorrow. And I want to let you know as well, if you are not already following my friend JD at the History Underground, today he launched the beginning of a new series from the battlefield of Little Bighorn, telling that story. It's one I've been wanting to get to for a long time. He got there first, and I know he's going to do a fantastic job with that series, so check that out. I'm also going to be joining JD and my friend Jared Frederick, Dr. Jared Frederick now, later on for a live stream today on the History Underground, where we're going to be kind of recapping Masters of the Air and talking about what they got right, what we think they did well, what maybe they didn't flesh out enough, kind of talking a little bit more about that story in that series. So check that out later today. It's at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be going live on that channel. So looking forward to talking to my 2 friends about that. I want to thank Matthew in Fairbanks, Alaska, who is a producer level patron here on the channel. I could not do it without your support. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Sitting Bull opens his eyes. Above him is the clear sky and the faces of his people looking down. He is bleeding, exhausted, in excruciating pain. The blood loss has made him pass out. For 2 days, he has performed the annual sun dance, looking for guidance from the Great Spirit. He has been made war chief of the Lakota. White invaders have come seeking gold in the sacred Black Hills in violation of treaties, and blue coat cavalry are on their way, sworn to kill any Lakota refusing to live on reservations. In acts of sacrifice and endurance, Sitting Bull has fasted for days while dancing and cut 100 pieces of flesh from his arms. But when he'd lost consciousness, that's when the vision came. Bluecoats falling from the sky like grasshoppers, upside down, their hats tumbling from their heads, falling into the Lakota camp. It prophesizes a great victory, a victory that will come within days, beside a river called the Little Bighorn.
So I don't know how much of the backstory we'll get into. I know that Little Bighorn is, again, that is the English-speaking American version of the battle. I believe they know it as the Battle of the Greasy Grass. So I'm sure there's a lot more to the story, though, than Little Bighorn. Little Bighorn is not the end of the story either for Sitting Bull. He lives another little more than a decade after that.
If you'd like to see the next episode of this Sitting Bull series immediately after watching this one a full week early, you can do that on Nebula. Learn how after the episode. Sitting Bull. His name stirs up images of the Great Plains, of Custer's last stand, of a grizzled chief.
And, you know, funny, kind of just a side here.
Images of the Great Plains, of
about Custer. You know, we all think of Custer with that long flowing blonde hair that he had. He'd actually had his hair cut really short just before that expedition that leads to his death at Little Bighorn. So he did not look like that at Little Bighorn.
Custer's last stand, of a grizzled chief in a war bonnet. And that's really no wonder, for Sitting Bull was a titan, a man who achieved legendary status within his own lifetime and became one of the most photographed men of his era. A figure who became internationally known for his victory at Little Bighorn, who rocked America to its core and defined the image of a Native American. He was also a man whose stubborn resistance to subjugation, even to his death, remains a powerful symbol to indigenous movements. A man so great that the government who killed him later put him on their postage stamp. But that future seemed a remote one. Born in what is now South Dakota, or possibly Montana, between 1831 and...
There's only one N in Montana, just saying. But my understanding is he was probably born closer to Montana.
1837. His father was a chief of the Hunkpapa Lakota. as were two of his uncles, meaning he had much to live up to. And he
Yeah, I guess there are two ends in Montana. I meant at the end, there's only one.
didn't start as Sitting Bull. That was originally his father's name. Instead, he was known as Jumping Badger. However, soon, his careful and considered nature, weighing options and thinking before he acted, ensured that everyone called him by the inglorious nickname of Slow. Jumping Badger wouldn't have to live with that handle for long, though, for he would have...
I'm just curious to know, like, if our culture had a similar way of naming people. And it's not unique to the indigenous peoples of the United States that to name people this way. Like, what would our names be? Mine would probably be something like One Who Talks Too Much or something like that. But, you know, it's just fascinating to think about in your own life. And I'd be curious. Let me know in the comment section, what would your name be if people named you based on some character trait of yours?
have ample opportunity to prove himself as a warrior. For the Lakota prided themselves on their warrior culture with its virtues of bravery, fortitude, generosity, and wisdom, and were constantly fighting enemies. Though perhaps not the enemies you immediately imagine.
No, yeah.
Because while later he would become famous for fighting the U.S. cavalry, young Jumping Badger's early years were spent fighting the Lakota's traditional enemies.
The Crow.
Other Native Americans, particularly the Crow people.
Yeah, we make a mistake when we think of the Plains Indians Wars, or even of history in general once white Europeans start arriving on North and South American continents. We do ourselves a disservice when we think of the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples as one big group who were all united and whose enemy was the white man. They had plenty enemies of their own. Just as white Europeans had been fighting for centuries against each other, it was no different with these various Native American groups. And yeah, the Crow are going to become kind of one of the well-known enemies of the Lakota and the people that we call the Sioux. So much so that they're going to kind of ally themselves with the United States as Manifest Destiny is taking hold, and the Americans, white European Americans, are moving further and further to the west.
In the first 2 decades of Jumping Badger's life, the Lakota were in a odd transitional position. A century before his birth, they had been agriculturalists who hunted and fished to supplement their diet. But then the Cheyenne had given them something that totally changed their life. Horses, brought by European colonists. Now mounted, the Lakota could take up what was known as horse culture, a way of life that involved following the enormous herds of buffalo. And the buffalo gave them most of what they needed, from meat to furs to skin for their tents, cured and made weatherproof by a concoction made from the buffalo's brain. Firearms, another import from settlers, also made hunting buffalo even easier. Though when Jumping Badger killed his first buffalo at the age of 10, he did so with a bow and arrow.
And all of this is really important in understanding what happens later on at places like Little Bighorn, because as the white man is encroaching further and further west, and to understand all of that, remember, the United States of America has this idea that is really kind of part of the ethos of Americans, is the idea of westward expansion. The idea of manifest destiny. By this point, later on in Sitting Bull's life, the west coast of the United States has already kind of become part of the country with statehood. Oregon and California are states by the time you get to the American Civil War. Now, as the railroad comes and you get the Transcontinental Railroad in the mid-1870s, it's really just going to rapidly speed up that process of expansion, and the buffalo is going to be key to that. The buffalo are going to just be slaughtered by the tens of thousands, and it's really going to destroy their way of life.
But he was 14 when he gained the name he would use for the rest of his life. In an attack on a group of Crow warriors, he managed to count coup, to ride up and touch an enemy in combat, then escape unharmed, shaming him. It was one of the bravest acts a Lakota warrior could accomplish. So, when they returned to camp, his father, who had also distinguished himself that day, announced that he would take the new name of Jumping Bull. To his son, he bestowed an eagle feather and his former name of Buffalo Bull Who Sits Down. a name that emphasized both pride and a dogged determination not to be moved. A name frequently shortened by outsiders to Sitting Bull.
And see, that was my understanding, is that Buffalo Who Sits Down was the proper name, and Sitting Bull just bull is just the name of a male cow, we know that, but it also is the name of a male buffalo, in this case, or bison. So it's just a kind of a nickname, I guess, that stuck.
It was a fitting name. Sitting Bull would go on to win fame for his valor in war. Carrying a shield made by his father, he battled warriors from rival groups with a determination equal to his new name. Once, when challenging a Crow chief to single combat, that very shield saved his life, deflecting a bullet into his foot before he killed the rival hand to hand. Soon, he was a member of both the Kit Fox Warrior Society and the Midnight Strongheart Society, two of the most prestigious warrior groups in the Lakota. And such was his fame that Dakota warriors would supposedly charge their enemies while shouting, "I am Sitting Bull!" as an intimidation tactic. Before long, he was named the leader of the Stronghearts. His reputation as a medicine man also grew, for from childhood, he'd had visions. When Sitting Bull dreamed of rain, the skies would open. His predictions came true. During the annual Sundance, he was also among the warriors who would cut themselves or even thread cords through the muscle of their chests and hang from the central pole, a feat of endurance to bring favor on his community.
So you have to think that if you're in a culture that values not only a warrior, but also someone who is seen as kind of a holy man, when you're both of those things, you're just going to rise to the top in some leadership role. He's gaining the respect of his people in multiple ways. He's going to be looked up to not only as a great warrior, but also as a wise man. And I think it's really more in kind of that latter role that he is responsible for leadership when you get to things like the Little Bighorn, because I think it's really Crazy Horse. It's kind of the military guy that's on the front lines fighting there.
And increasingly, he took on more leadership roles. However, it should be noted that that meant something different in Lakota terms. For in the Lakota culture, warriors made decisions for themselves, both in war and peace. Meaning to be a leader was simply to have enough clout that others would follow you out of respect or inspiration, but not duty.
I say this all the time, that I think leadership is more about influence and how you use it than it is about title or position. And this is really kind of a major aside to what we're talking about, but I think it is illustrated perfectly by Sitting Bull, especially in light of what they've just said there. You can be in a position of leadership, say a governor or a senator or the president of a company or something, and there is inherently in that position a certain amount of influence that comes with it because of your position. Teddy Roosevelt called it the bully pulpit. But leadership is then how you use that influence. Some people are given a great deal of influence, but they don't use it well. They're not leaders. You can be in a position of leadership, but not be a leader. Or you can likewise not be put in a position of great leadership and responsibility, but still use what influence you have and thereby be a leader. Some people lead just by being, a common soldier. And so Sitting Bull is not necessarily being given a title or a position of leadership, but he is just inherently a person who wields a great deal of influence and thereby is a leader. I hope that makes sense.
If a chief decided to declare war, for instance, and a band considered it ill-advised, that group was free to leave and join another village that advocated peace. Yet unsettled times were approaching for the Lakota. For decades, they'd heard rumors about settler expansion into the southern plains, railways crossing the country, and the terrible slaughter of the buffalo. But all that too still seemed far away. Similarly, their nomadic lifestyle had somewhat mitigated the impact of epidemic diseases.
Yeah, so because of their position, and if you think about it in terms of looking at the map, they're in the upper part of that Great Plains. So they're not really, they're further north than, say, the Oregon Trail, in places where Americans have been crossing in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And so it's only as the entire border of the United States is shifting further to the west that they're going to find themselves on the front lines of this. And that's really going to start to happen in a major way in the 1860s as the railroad and as just population increases push the borders further west. Now they're on the front lines.
In fact, though certainly diminished, the Lakota were among the few tribes whose population grew in the 19th century. By the 1850s, however, these problems were on their doorstep. Increasingly, settlers came from the east, and the U.S. government approached the Lakota and other Plains tribes, pushing them to sign treaties that defined territory. Some of these, like the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, designated areas like the Sacred Black Hills to be reserved for the Lakota, but others heavily restricted tribes to pieces of reservation land, often called agencies. Paramount among the government's concerns was that the tribe also give up their nomadic way of life following the buffalo, whose herds were already starting to thin.
If your entire culture is based on the idea of being on horseback and going where the hunt is, going where the weather's appropriate for what you need, and now this government agency is coming in and telling you, no, you have to confine yourself to a particular area. Well, that's just not who they are. That's who we are, white Europeans. That's how we understand things, is ownership and land and territory and government structures. This is not who they are.
Easily killed en masse with rifles, the settlers mostly only used the tender meat of the buffalo's tongue and left the rest to rot. Often they shot the animal for no other reason other than the pleasure of it, and sometimes even from moving trains. In fact, buffalo bones littered some plains so heavily, train passengers often mistook it for snow. These treaties promised the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and other tribes that if they settled on the agencies, the government would give them food and medicine in return. And with the increasing depletion of the buffalo, a certain faction of the Lakota argued that this might be the best deal they could get, while others argued they could stay on the agency in winter when nomadic life was hardest, then slip out and follow the buffalo in the summer.
Yeah, and so you can see there that there is an element of trying to come up with a compromise. It's not an immediate, just outright violent rejection of what the government is proposing. They're trying to say, you know what, let's try and work with these people, but let's also not completely give up our way of life and our identity of who we are. And that's completely reasonable to do that. And just like with any group, there are going to be varies of opinion in all of that. And the ones that go along with it are going to be seen by the American government as the ones who are friendly and who are working with us and reasonable. And the ones who say, no, we want to stand for our way of life, they're going to be viewed as the hostiles.
Accommodation and trade would get them more than active resistance, they argued. But Sitting Bull did not trust these promises, nor any accommodation.
Wise.
He chose resistance. And resist he must, for the Bluecoats were coming. The Badlands, Dakota Territory, August 9th, 1864. Ambush and retreat.
And just context here, this is while the American Civil War is going on. This is the beginning stages of the siege of Petersburg in Virginia. This is around the time that Sherman is taking Atlanta. This is while things are really still going on in a big way in the eastern United States.
Ambush and retreat. Sitting Bull had not asked for this, what his enemies called the Dakota War. In truth, it had been another band of Lakota who had ambushed and killed the white settlers. Yet when 4,000 Bluecoats had flooded in to exert retribution, they'd attacked his village of followers at Killdeer instead.
They're all the same. I mean, that's basically the viewpoint here, is that you're Lakota. Well, Lakota did this, so you're the problem, even though the American government doesn't really recognize that there are varying groups here and that there are some people who are involved and some aren't. They're just going to lump everybody together.
Sitting Bull led 4 different tribes of Lakota, none of which had fought the soldiers before. They charged the Bluecoat line on horseback, taking terrible casualties from artillery, but slowing the army's advance so the village could evacuate. Now, the Bluecoat commander was chasing them into the rugged Badlands, just as Sitting Bull wanted. As the enemy marches through the broken ground, the Lakota harass them, springing ambushes with their bows and muskets. Few Bluecoat soldiers die, but by the time they finally make Fort Union, they are exhausted and drained of supplies. Declaring victory, they board riverboats and abandoned the expedition. The Dakota War was over, but sadly, it was a mere prelude. For within a year, the Bluecoats would return, and Sitting Bull would be embroiled in a new conflict. when an alliance of disgruntled tribes, tired of broken treaties and federal harassment, staged the uprising known as Red Cloud's War. And you...
All right, so we're going to dive right into part 2 now.
It's 1862, and the U.S. government has just received a letter confessing to an assassination. The victim, Bear's Rib, a Hunkpapa Lakota chief who had agreed to receive an annuity of goods from the U.S. government, at least before he was shot outside of his tent one night. "We notified the Bear's Rib yearly not to receive your goods," reads the letter signed by 9 Hunkpapa chiefs. "He had no ears, and we gave him ears by killing him. We now say to you, bring us no more goods. If any of our people receive any more from you, we will give them ears as we did the Bear's Ribs.
Wow.
We also say to you that we wish you to stop the whites from traveling through our country, and if you do not stop them, we will. If your whites have no ears, we will give them ears." Now, Sitting Bull...
And it's kind of interesting to hear that because there's going to be an event that happens later on in the aftermath of the Battle of Little Bighorn, where you're going to find that the women have actually used their tools to like poke out the eardrums of some of the soldiers, so that they, or maybe it was just Custer, I can't remember, so that they could hear better in the next life. So this is a big deal in the culture there, is to say, hey, listen, we're speaking the truth. We are being honest with you about how we feel about all of this. Take us at our word, and you need to listen to what we're saying.
Was not one of these 9 chiefs. For while Bear's Rib advocated for peace, accommodation, and a middle way, Sitting Bull represented the other extreme. No treaties, no agreements. And if that meant war, let there be war. Thanks so much to the fine folks over at Cell to Singularity for helping to support today's historical tale. The assassination of Bear's Rib, or Bear's Ribs, accounts differ on his name, show the difficult position of the Lakota in the 1860s. By all accounts, Bear's Ribs didn't want to accept the annual delivery of goods the U.S. agents were pressing onto him, but he felt he had little choice. He wanted to avoid war, believing it would bring ruin, so he tried to take a middle path and was killed for it.
So you can see both sides here. I mean, if you think about it. On one hand, you're going to have the people who might be seen as kind of the realists that are saying, you know what, this is not a fight we can win. So better to survive than to stand up and die in the attempt. But you can also see Sitting Bull's argument here, and the people like him who feel the same way. This is our way of life, and it's worth fighting for, and it's worth dying for if need be. And who knows, maybe we can win. Maybe we can inflict enough casualties on these people that they understand we're going to fight to the last. So I can respect and understand both sides of this.
And again, while Sitting Bull was not one of the 9 chiefs who signed that letter, he definitely wasn't above giving the settlers ears. Indeed, while the U.S. Army had declared the 1862 Dakota War finished, it was by no means over for Sitting Bull. Actually, from his perspective, it had never really begun. He'd heard no declaration of war, no pronouncement that the Bluecoats were coming to avenge the deaths of settlers. Not only had the Hunkpapa not been the ones who'd attacked the settlers, in violation of the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, not a single Hunkpapa had been present when that treaty had been signed. A chief from another Lakota tribe had been designated as representing all Lakota and made his mark on a document after a negotiation mired in mistranslation and intentional deception.
So just to put this in perspective, imagine then if, say, the governor of Ohio went to negotiate a treaty from his own perspective on things and was designated by an enemy force as representing all of the United States. Obviously, the rest of the United States will say, wait a second, he doesn't speak for me. But they're going to say, well, hey, no, he represents all of you. Or saying, we're going to attack Florida because Ohio signed this treaty and Tennessee violated it. You see what I mean?
These treaties essentially laid out 3 items. First, it drew borders for the Plains tribes, insisting that tribes stick to their own territory rather than following the buffalo. Second, it instructed them to stop warring amongst themselves and attacking settlers. And third, in return for this, the government would keep settlers out of tribal territories, and Indian agents would distribute food and goods to those living on those agencies of reserved land. However, if a tribe violated the first 2 clauses, U.S. troops could legally fight them, which is how the Dakota War began. So in other words, the Dakota War began when a tribe Sitting Bull was not a part of attacked settlers in a place that he wasn't present, violating a treaty he never agreed to. And because of this, the army had attacked his camp, without warning, burning treasured belongings and killing women and children.
What would you do? I dare say that most of us would react the exact same way that Sitting Bull did in this situation.
Before then, he'd never fought any white soldiers, only other tribes. And now, he refused to stop fighting just because the others had surrendered. Especially since, after several large groups of Dakota surrendered, 38 warriors were hanged in the largest mass execution in U.S. history, while other prisoners and their families died of cholera in internment camps. Perhaps partially for this reason, Sitting Bull increasingly believed any dealing with the whites would mean the death of not just the Lakota, but the whole loose political confederation the U.S. government insisted on calling the Sioux. But during the Dakota War, he'd also learned...
That's a great point, as we use that term Sioux to describe all of the Plains Indians in that part of the country. But that's like assuming that all Americans are the same. We're not. We're all very, very different. We are complex. We have differing political and religious beliefs. We have differing cultures from one place to another. Heck, my part of Ohio is completely different than most of the rest of the state. Again, we do ourselves a disservice when we lump all these groups of people into one. They were very different.
How costly fighting the Bluecoats could be. These soldiers did not carry the musket trade guns of his youth, but rather rifled mini-ball killers, and increasingly, repeating rifles. Worst of all was the mountain howitzers, which the Lakota referred to as the gun that shoots twice, due to the boom of the cannon, then the burst of the exploding shell. Indeed, he witnessed their damage firsthand by bandaging a wound his uncle Four Horns received during the Battle of Killdeer, and then he himself being shot in the hip with a pistol after a raid on an overturned wagon. The powerful war medicine of his shield, activated by a song to invoke its powers, had kept him alive. But the wound was sobering. They simply could not fight the Bluecoats head-on. So instead, he initiated a guerrilla war against forts and settler trains.
This is literally the standard modus operandi for a small, weaker force against a larger, better equipped, better trained one. This is the exact same idea that the American patriots had against the British in the Revolutionary War. We can't go toe-to-toe with them in battle after battle, but we can create an advantageous situation where we spread them out, we use guerrilla tactics, we draw them away from their supplies, their bases of strength, and we isolate and destroy pockets of them.
See, gold deposits had been discovered in Montana, and increasingly, thousands of miners were blazing a trail through Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho territory to mine it out. These were treaty violators, illegally occupying Indian land and scaring the buffalo away with their clumsy hunts. So, when Sitting Bull's forces harried these efforts, the miners and troops accompanying them responded with deadly force, and at times, even more horrifying tactics. At one point, settlers intentionally poisoned a box of hardtack and left it partially burned, knowing it would be salvaged and brought to the village. 100 people, mostly women and children, died after consuming it. And despite the fact the treaties promised the U.S. government would keep these settlers out of their territory in the first place, the United States found it politically unpalatable to use force against white citizens on behalf of Indians.
And this is the unfortunate reality, is that whatever treaties were made, first of all, were not made with all of these Native Americans. They were only made with certain pockets of them. But then the government was either unwilling or unable to even enforce its own side of the treaty. And this is especially going to lead, and I'm getting ahead of myself, to the war in 1876 that culminates with the events of the Little Bighorn and then the aftermath of that. That all happens because white settlers go into an area they aren't supposed to be in by treaty. They find gold, and then everybody rushes in there, and the government's like, well, meh. And as much as I love Ulysses S. Grant as a man, it was his presidency that oversaw that happen.
So, Sitting Bull and others like him decided to take matters further into their own hands. In response, the U.S. Army set up a series of forts to protect the miners, which the Lakota considered another treaty violation. Though, in truth, by the 1851 treaty, the land they operated on was owned by the Crow, and the Lakota had either captured or occupied it, depending on your perspective, since then. Either way, due to these provocations, in 1866, the Oglala Lakota chief, Red Cloud, formed a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and went to war on the U.S. Army. He actually quickly dealt a serious blow to the Federals that December when he lured 81 soldiers into an ambush, killing them to a man. At the time, the largest victory of Plains tribes over Federal troops. Within 2 years,
I want to talk about that for just a second. So the event they're referring to there in late 1866 is known as the Fetterman Fight, or sometimes the Fetterman Massacre, and that's because the name of the man who was in command of the American soldiers there was William Fetterman. And basically, you've got these 81 U.S. soldiers who are killed by something between like 1,000 and 2,000 Native American, including Crazy Horse, who we're going to hear about later on. He's part of that Oglala Sioux tribe. And basically what they do is they draw the American forces out beyond the site of the fort and their safety to an area where it's 4 miles from Fort Phil Kearny, where they're isolated and destroyed. And that's what I was just talking about, the idea of you're not going to attack the fort, but if you can draw some of the men out of the fort and get them into a place where you can wipe them out, that's what you're going to go for. And so, of course, this being spun as the Fetterman Massacre just further enrages the American populace that look at these savage Indians who are killing these poor white soldiers on the plains. And it's just going to embolden people further and further, and it's just going to escalate the tensions.
U.S. government, unable to fight the war and secure the construction crews of the Transcontinental Railroad, decided to settle with Red Cloud. They pulled out of the forts, and in the Second Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, laid out the Great Sioux Reservation, containing the Powder River region that had previously belonged to the Crows, and the sacred Black Hills. One major stipulation was also that white people could not settle there without Lakota consent. But that was not enough for Sitting Bull, who to this point had been a relatively peripheral figure in the war. Red Cloud could do as he wished, and Red Cloud would stay on the reservation for the rest of his life, but Sitting Bull disdained any accommodation. He believed that to be dependent on the U.S. government for food would only put the Lakota in their power.
He's right. And again, put yourself in his position. What do? We're going to rely on this outside agency for our food, and we're going to have to completely change our way of life. We're going to have to settle into an area. It's not who we are. It's not what our culture is. It's not what we've ever done. And by relying on someone else, inevitably there are going to be strings attached. And how far are we going to be willing to go along with what they say in order for us to be able to receive from them what we need?
"You are fools," he said, "to make yourselves slaves to a piece of fat bacon, some hardtack, and a little coffee and sugar." For his part, he would continue to follow the buffalo, and he would continue to fight the army, the settlers, and the railroad crews. For the one thing that Red Cloud had given up was the right for the United States to put a railroad straight through Lakota land. And it was in a skirmish with these railroad surveyors and the troops protecting them that Sitting Bull performed his greatest act of military valor. For years, Sitting Bull had battled rumors of cowardice. He was what was known as an old man chief now, in his 40s, and more of a holy man and political leader.
In his 40s, he's an old man? Oh, I take that personally.
Than the fearsome front-rank fighter of his younger days. And many of his followers, those still willing to fight, were young warriors. Men who had not yet counted coup and bristled at the idea of sedentary living without proving their manhood on the hunt or in battle first. And in this environment, accusations of cowardice are dangerous. So Sitting Bull does something unbelievably brave. He strides towards the enemy, unarmed. Bullets buzz in the air around him and slap dirt clods up around his feet, though he seems unconcerned. Doesn't he?
Think about, again, what we've been talking about how he has been viewed as not only this great warrior in his younger years, but also this wise and holy man. And now if you do something like this and show no fear and also survive, Think about the message that sends, especially to those younger warriors.
Even look at the men trying to kill him. Instead, trusting to his war medicine to keep him
He just
unharmed,
lights one up.
he sits, begins to light his pipe, and then calls to his companions to join him. Ducking and nervous, bullets still flying past them left and right, a few come, sitting in a circle and puffing hectically at the pipe in a display of bravado. But not Sitting Bull. He nurses that tobacco in contemplative silence as bullets still drum around him. Then, his pipe smoke out and his companions starting to edge away, he simply knocks the burnt plug out of it and begins to clean the bowl. When he finally walks back totally unharmed, no one will ever question the old man chief's bravery again.
Heck no.
Instead, he has created a legend that will make more men follow him straight into the jaws of the enemy, right into the little bighorn.
So, I like I said at the beginning, I didn't know a ton of his backstory beyond some of the major events that he's involved in, but I can absolutely see why people would flock to this guy, why people would follow him, and especially people who feel the way he does, that they're going to fight for their way of life, that they're not going to rely on this outside group that seems to be violating treaties anyway. So there's really just no downside for them in all of this, at least in their minds. I totally get why they'd be willing to fight for this, and I can absolutely respect it. So we'll continue on, and like I said, if you want to learn more about the Battle of Little Bighorn itself, my friend JD at the History Underground started a series today on that I know is going to be fantastic. The first episode certainly was, and I'm looking forward to seeing more. So I'll throw up some links to some other videos, and yes, I know I say I'll throw up, and I know that's become a new thing. I'm going to try to find a better way to word that in the future. I'll put up some links to some other videos you can check out. We'll see you again tomorrow with episodes 3 and 4. Thanks for watching.